Yeah, no, I understand. And we see I do that too.
Obviously, we have a change of plans here. Dr. Holmes is going to introduce everybody. So,
do some stuff you enjoy doing at night.
we point out that the next person is Mark Motsinger. And you've got his bio there, but what I found out by just Googling his name is he has a very interesting area he lives in. And the one challenge he hasn't successfully followed through on is there's an abandoned silver mine in the area, and he's letting the mere fact that it's full of water keep him stalled out. So that's Martha Marks.
I'm going to set a timer. Because see, I'm used to bells ringing. Tell me when it's time.
You're not hearing bells now.
Okay, my name is Mark Motsinger. I'm from the southern tip of Illinois. And I'm here to talk to you about the connection of Southern Illinois and the Southern Campaign. Now, most of you are probably thinking, what in the world is a guy from Illinois doing down here? Well, I have come down here on vacation. I've taken kayaks and tromped off down the PD and tromped all over Snow Island and have done lots of different excursions down here. And I've wanted to come to this symposium for years, but I finally retired and I get to do a few things like that. And I was scared to death that this year I was going to not be able to come because of the COVID scare, but it looks like we're braving through that. But my story kind of starts with this guy right here. This is my Uncle Holbert. Holbert was a school teacher. Now my grandpa, who was born in 1900, used to say about his brother Holbert, he used to say, yeah, Holbert, he's a little lazy, he's just a school teacher. And it used to frustrate my dad and I because my dad was a college professor and I was a school teacher, and my mom would get a little aggravated because she was a third grade teacher, but my grandpa thought it was kind of funny, and he would say it every chance he got about his brother Holbert. He was just a little lazy. Well, he thought that anybody that didn't get out and use a pickaxe or whatever must be just a little bit lazy. That was my grandpa for you. He retired when he was 94 years old from his second career as running a gas station, and he bought furs. Now, Southern Illinois is a little different than what most of you think. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But the main thing I want to say about Holbert is why he was kind of my inspiration. Growing up, I would go to what was called the Motsinger Reunion. Now, I'm the president of it now, and I think there's about 12 people show up anymore. But used to, there would be 200-300 people. You know how family reunions are. A lot of them have kind of drying up. But we'd have it on the old side of the old shed, Motsinger Shed Church, where it was located. And Uncle Holbert, he'd get up there. He died in '81, but he'd get up there and he'd say, "It's time for the story." And he'd say, "Now here's a guy he was a teacher most of his life. He quit high school to become the teacher." And he'd say, "The Motsingers came to America in 1735. They went to Pennsylvania and ended up in the Carolinas." And I remember hearing that every year. Then he'd tell a story about Felix. How Felix Motsinger served with Francis Marion. And how he was the eyes of the swamp fox, is what he called it. Well, I can relate with something somebody else said because I looked him up and said he was a scout, a spy, and a scrounger. So Okay, that sounds good. Instead of a major, he was the eyes of the swamp fox. So you know how family stories go. But anyway, Hobart always talked about him, so I was always fascinated with the story of the swamp fox. And you know, I watched the Leslie Nielsen show and all that stuff. And you know, when The Patriot came out, I was all excited a few years ago. But I didn't really know that much about my family until I started really kind of studying and found out that a lot of what Hobart had surmised might not have necessarily been right, but a lot of it was right on a few things. Now, currently I am the curator of the Saline Creek Pioneer Village and Museum, which is in Saline County. Saline County is a county that was formed by an act when one of the oldest counties, Gallup County, split up, and Abraham Lincoln came down and argued in favor of Saline County being made as a county, and it became what it's named after, the Saline Wells, which is salt wells that at one time 1/3 of the state revenue came from this salt well. It's the only place in Illinois where slavery was prohibited. That was not prohibited. You could actually have, because it was a federally owned site, you could actually have slaves at this one particular place. Because they are politically correct now, it is no longer the old slave house, it is the Crenshaw House. The state of Illinois bought it, and it is falling into ruins. But that's another story. Don't get me going on that one. But anyway, so when somebody says, "Are you from Illinois?" I said, "Yes," and they automatically think I'm from Chicago. But actually, I'm from this Illinois. This is the very southern tip. We're all across the state is what is known as the Shawnee National Forest and the Shawnee Hills. We're basically in a deep hole in the Ohio Valley, but we have a lot of rocky outcrops, a lot of hills. A lot of the area is basically what I would consider similar to, say, parts of Kentucky and Missouri Ozarks. As a matter of fact, they used to call it the Illinois Ozarks, so it's completely different than the rest of the state. It's different topographically, and it's different in a lot of other ways. One of the other ways it's different is migration patterns, and that's something that I kind of got to looking at. If you look at the people in Chicago, there's so many different nationalities and things up there, but the people in the very southern tip of the state have been there for quite some time. Most people don't move around much. Most of them are either farmers or coal miners, or anymore now, if you commit a crime in Chicago, they put you in a prison in Southern Illinois. But it is a completely different environment. It is completely different. Everything's different about it. The type of jobs people do, the incomes people have, we really don't have a whole lot in common. One of the things that's going on right now is actually a separation movement. People are trying to separate. There's almost a revolution about ready to take place in Illinois. It's kind of interesting. But so with that said, why am I connecting the revolution to Southern Illinois? Well, I'll tell you why. It's because of migration patterns. Now, if you know anything about Illinois and the American Revolution, or if you know anything about the early part of Illinois, Illinois was actually a French colony at one time, and there's a very small portion of it actually had some very early towns. As a matter of fact, if you look up here, you can see that Cahokia, 1696, that's pretty far back. Kaskaskia, 1702, Prairie du Rocher, 1722, and at that time, this area right here had a decent population of people. This area had no one, literally nobody. This area up in here, mostly Indians. A few settlements up here that were French, but we had a French settlement and basically no man's land. Now, what we do know about the American Revolution in Illinois is associated with George Rogers Clark. George Rogers Clark and his men came into Southern Illinois. Basically what they did was they came up the Ohio River, crossed right here, just a few miles below where I live, captured Kaskaskia, Cahokia, and eventually Vincennes. And in 1778, on July the 4th, they actually rang a bell to read to the people of the French people in Kaskaskia the Declaration of Independence. So we actually have what's called the Liberty Bell of the West. So, you know, we have that. We do have some action that takes place during the American Revolution. Now, why this is important is because the first group of settlers that are going to come into Southern Illinois and settle after the Revolution are going to be George Rogers Clark's men. Most of these guys hail from Virginia, North Carolina, and places like that. Now, they're going to come in and they're going to settle, but where they're going to settle is mostly right around in here. Here's just a kind of a partial list of some of these guys. Randolph County, St. Clair, Madison County, Monroe County, Jackson County, which are basically this area right here. This is where a lot of these guys settle. So we're starting to get a settlement of people, but after the war, and most of these guys that are coming in are, well, they called them Virginians. Of course, they called everybody that at that time. So this is who's settling this part of Southern Illinois. And you can see here the routes that Clark took. And this is where they came back and settled later on. They saw how fertile it was. This is actually, a lot of people don't realize, one of the largest and oldest cities in prehistoric United States is Cahokia, which is about right here. So this is a very fertile area that the French settled. And then these guys, these Long Knives, eventually came and settled there. Now, with that said, in 1787, we have the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Territory is divided up, and I really wish Thomas Jefferson's idea that this right here would be a separate state called Politania. I wish it would have taken place, but it didn't. We ended up getting, I was telling the guy earlier, said this area right here was supposed to be a separate state called Assyria. But eventually, Illinois will become a state, but they don't have anybody living there. There's just not enough people. So what's going to happen in 1787, October 22nd, Continental Congress is going to come up with what they call the Old Soldiers Reservation. So to remedy this, the way a lot of these guys that served in the war hadn't got paid anything. So guess what? We're going to give them land in a place that nobody wants to go. Well, some of these guys sold it for mere pennies on a dollar. But other ones decided to move in. And this is what it said. Beginning at the mouth of the Ohio River, thence up the Mississippi to the mouth of the Osvos, which is the Big Muddy, thence up the stream to the running straight west from the mouth of the Little Wabash, thence east along the west line to the Wabash, thence down the Wabash and the Ohio to the beginning. So basically, it's this area right here. Now, what's interesting about that is, there's hardly anybody living there. This comes from a book by William Nelson Moyers. It's entitled The Old Soldiers Reservation. And I'd heard about this all my life, and as I got to studying it and looking at it a little bit more, it really became interesting. This is actually out of the journals of the Continental Congress, and it literally says exactly what he said. Because when I first read it in his book, I wanted to make sure that it actually happened. And I found it in the journals. This is in Continental Congress, Volume 33, Journal. Now, what we find out is most of these people that are in Southern Illinois, if you get to talking to them, and I teach history, so I talk to the kids, where did they come from? Oh, we came from the Carolinas. Well, you almost find out that almost every person that's been in Southern Illinois very long came like this. Started out in Pennsylvania, came down the Great Wagon Road. They lived in the Carolinas for a while. Then they eventually crossed over into Tennessee, maybe stayed in Wilson County, Tennessee for a little while, and eventually came up to Southern Illinois. Ironically, when I left home, that's exactly the way I came. Why? That was the best way to go. That's where they built the road. But what ends up happening is you have all these people who live in Southern Illinois who have Southern heritage. As a matter of fact, they're a little different. There's a book that just recently came out called Greater Appalachia. Nobody's seen that. And what he's saying is that technically this part of Indiana, this part of Illinois, Missouri Ozarks, and even parts of Texas are actually extensions of what we call the upland south of the Greater Appalachia. And it's because that's where they came from. So when you look at Southern Illinois, you wonder what in the world is going on there with all the liberal policies and the crazy stuff that's going up in Chicago. And you find out that there's actually a movement in Southern Illinois here lately to guess what? Secede. Matter of fact, tomorrow in my hometown, there's supposed to be 1,200 cars in a parade going all the way across the state, honking and holding secession signs, and signs that say Pritzker sucks, the life out of Illinois. It's our governor. But that's why Southern Illinois is so different. It's because the people who are there came from here. And they were young men who got their pay for fighting in the Southern campaign, and their pay was land in Southern Illinois. Now, interesting thing about that is nobody wanted to live there, and there was a big problem before the War of 1812. It was very common to get your hair lifted because a new group of Indians had moved in and pushed out the Illinois Indians, and now they were living up in this area, and the Chickasaw were down here coming up into this area. The Shawnee had pretty much been driven out, but you have the Pinkashaw and the Kickapoo and the Winnebagos that are moving down into this area, and you had to be pretty tough to go live there. What's better? A bunch of young Revolutionary War veterans from the Upland South. So that's who they bring in. Now, where they're going to have an entry point. These are what is called the Shawnee Hills. Now, the Shawnee Hills in themselves are beautiful. You can't believe they're in Illinois. Along the edge, and this is where the glacier stopped, pretty good farm ground. I live about right here. This farm ground became highly sought after by these people from the Carolinas who were moving up into this area. They got to have an entry point. Well, this is going to be the entry point. Right in here. The only trails that you have are from Vincennes to what's called St. Louis and Cahokia and to Kaskaskia. Up in here, all Indian tribes. The entry point now is going to be Shawneetown. Shawneetown is one of the only, there's two towns that the federal government actually just started. Washington, D.C. and Shawneetown. The reason they did was they needed to have a land office and a place with a banking system for all these guys that were coming up from the Carolinas so they could register their land, so they could borrow money to improve their land, and they could move in. So Shawneetown ends up being kind of the entry point into Illinois. This is one of the banks that was built there in 1837. And eventually you start having other roads and other trails. People start putting ferries across different places. But Shawneetown remains the main place, the federal land office, for the people who were moving into Illinois. When my family first came into Illinois, he had to travel to Shawneetown to register his land deed. This is the old bank, the Marshall Bank. And one of the ironic things about this bank, and it's always been a legend, but it's actually true, is that in the 1830s, some guys were trying to start this town up north called Chicago. Or, do you know what Chicago means? Smelly onion, by the way. It's because there was a swamp with a bunch of onions. That's why you have the newspaper, The Onion, up there. Chicago, which was an Indian name, which means smelly onion. We like to say that instead of Illinois. But the bank down here, they came down and they said, we want to buy some bonds so we can start a city. And the legend is that they said, no, that city will never make anything. It's not on a river. Well, now we'll look at it. But anyway, so this is one of the first banks called the John Marshall Bank. Today, this is old Shawneetown, has a population of 193. The first capital of Illinois, which is Kaskaskia, has a population of 14. And Chicago has a population of what? Several million. So it's kind of ironic. But these towns eventually, the problem was, they were built too close to the river. They constantly flood. And when the river changes course, Kaskaskia is actually on the other side of the river. It's the only town in Illinois that's on the other side of the Mississippi. This is the floods of 1913, 1937. So, Illinois pretty much, Shawneetown kind of stopped becoming important. But for years, it was the place that people came to. Eventually, other people started moving in, and this is a guy named James Vance Lusk. He was born in the Waxhaw settlements in South Carolina. He will come in after the war, and on the Kentucky side, which he wasn't allowed to have a business on the Illinois side yet, he'll start a ferry. The ferry starts, goes across the Illinois, it eventually becomes a town, and it's the town of Golconda. So this is a guy from the South that eventually ends up in Illinois, and he's the founder of one of the towns. This is an old picture of the Lust Ferry area. It's also a crossing for the Trail of Tears. We also have a town in Illinois that's named Marion, and there's a lot of Marions. And I think Walt Disney said 21, something like that, on his beginning of the Swamp Fox. But Marion, Illinois, eventually became a town, and why did they name it that? Because so many of the men who were involved in the naming of the town said, hey, our fathers, our grandfathers, and even one of the men, a guy by the name of Joshua Tyner, had served under Francis Marion in the Carolinas before they came up. So what do? They named the town Marion. We also have a county named Marion, and the reason we have a county named Marion is because of this guy, whose father served under Marion. He's the founder of a town called Mount Vernon. His name is Zadok Casey. He had a pretty extinguished career. He was all kinds of things. He has a town named after him, Illinois House Representative, State Senator, Lieutenant Governor, officer in the Black Hawk War, member of the United States Congress, elected in the Illinois Constitution. So a lot of the founding fathers of Illinois had family or themselves came from the Carolinas and were involved in the Southern campaign. This is William Gaston. I won't spend too much time with this guy, but William Gaston is another person that is buried just right in our area. He has a pretty distinguished career. He served on the Broad River. He was at Charleston when it fell. He was at Williams Plantation, Battle of Rattonsville. He was at Kings Mountain. Ends up in Illinois. Now, a lot of the people that came in Illinois came in on these trails. And so a lot of the towns, like the town of Marion, pops up on this trail. Golconda pops up here. Shawneetown's here. Harrisburg's right here. A lot of these towns are going to pop up on these trails. Now, what's interesting too is that a lot of these men were from Rowan County, North Carolina. Rowan County must have been a huge county at one time, because a lot of these guys that actually served in the battles of Guilford Courthouse and a lot of these places, it just seems like almost every one of them had some connection to Rowan County. Zach Lively, he's from, was in the Southern campaign, and he's buried there in Southern Illinois. These are a couple of other guys. Private Moses Jones from North Carolina. He's buried in Franklin County. Hezekiah Davis, he's also buried there. Just down the road from my house is Private John Ellis. The Williamson County Historical Society has done a great job. They restored his tombstone. And this was a black soldier who fought with the 10th Regiment, Continental Line of the state of North Carolina. His family came and they put a new marker up there. There's a sign on the road that directs you to it. It's actually in some people's backyard. Then there's this guy, Isaac Rolston, another guy that's buried in Southern Illinois. He's buried in a really, really remote area. But he was at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse. He was captured and held prisoner for a while at Charleston. He ends up in Southern Illinois, and his grave this is his marker. About 2 years ago, a group from the Daughters of the American Revolution and Sons of the American Revolution in Polk County actually went in and replaced his marker. What's interesting about it is the Shawnee National Forest, which is federal property, would not allow them to bring in any kind of motorized vehicle. So they brought it in on a mule. And they had to go about a mile in. When they kept telling me we're going to bring it in on a mule, I was thinking like a Kawasaki mule. When they got there, it was literally a mule. But anyway, so this is kind of an interesting addition, and you know, people are starting to recognize the heritage of a lot of these people. And so many people, they say, well, Southern Illinois almost seceded from the Union. Well, that's not true either. What a lot of people don't realize is that Southern Illinois had a lot of people came there also because they were anti-slavery. They were Southerners, but they were also anti-slavery. The southern part of the state actually had the largest amount of people that joined the Union Army, this percentage that the governor set for them. So, you know, you see a lot of Confederate flags in Southern Illinois and that type of thing. And what a lot of people don't realize is that just because they had Southern roots, it doesn't mean that they were, you know, most people kind of fought regionally anyway. So, you know, Southern Illinois, most of them went and joined Union forces, and I'm sorry, but our county had a huge, don't hold this against me, a huge amount of guys that marched with Sherman. And a lot of them were coming home where their ancestors had come from, which is kind of an interesting story. If you've ever seen the movie, The Horse Soldier with John Wayne, most of those guys came from Saline County, Hamilton County, Gallatin County, and their training facility was Camp Mather, which is in Shawneetown. So a lot of these guys were, you know, they just were naturally born rugged individuals. And it's because of where their ancestors came from. This is another guy who's actually one of Marion's men. His name is Nathan Jaggers. He's buried in Southern Illinois, not far from where I live. He served in near the Santee River. Most of you probably recognize some of those names up there. But Nathan Jaggers actually settled in Southern Illinois. He came up there, and his family, the Jaggers, I've had Jaggers students in my class. A bunch of little roughneck kids named Jaggers. Wilson Henderson is another guy. Wilson Henderson just lives down the road. You can't find his farm. How many of you ever heard the John Prine song, Mr. Peabody's coal trains done hauled it away? Well, you can't find Nathan Jaggers' farm because Mr. Sahara's coal trains done hauled it away. His home is underneath Sahara Lake that used to be a big strip mine. But Wilson Henderson is very well thought of in Southern Illinois because he's the founder of the Baptist Union all over Southern Illinois. Now he was at Kings Mountain, some say he was at Charleston, he was at Camden, he was a lot of different, he fought with Sumter, he was all over the place. Actually went into the military at the age of 15. When he came to Southern Illinois, he came and he actually started all these churches. He started the Muddy River Baptist Association, the United Baptist Union of Illinois. He died in 1847, and he has a legacy of churches all over Southern Illinois. And what's interesting about that is that this guy is considered the founding father of Baptist churches in Southern Illinois, and nobody knows the connection that he has with the Revolution. Because if you talk to the Baptists in Southern Illinois, oh yes, Henderson, he's the guy that started our association and all that. But he actually has quite a background in the American Revolution. And having been from the South, he came up, and if you notice, these guys are like really nomadic. They're in Carolinas, then they're in Tennessee, then they're maybe in Kentucky, then they end up in Illinois. Now, you have the good, the bad, and the ugly as well. Now, let's go with the ugly. You also have these guys who came into Southern Illinois. All of them from the Carolinas, except for Mason. He may have been Virginia. Nobody knows for sure. But this is Samuel Mason, John Duff, and Philip and Peter Alston. I don't know if anybody's ever heard of the Alston brothers. He was a counterfeiter from South Carolina. Eventually got driven out of South Carolina, and they're going to all end up working together. This guy was one of the, if you've ever read the story about George Rogers Clark and how he captured a guy and was going to make him show him the trail, and the guy couldn't find the trail, so he said, if you don't find the trail in the next hour, I'm going to split your head with an axe. And he found the trail. He eventually joins Clark's forces, attacks Vincennes. Then when the war's over, he starts a criminal enterprise. He's eventually assassinated by two Frenchmen who were paid by Zebulon Pike to go and find him and kill him because he was causing all kinds of financial problems. But he was a counterfeiter. This guy, Samuel Mason, was a river pirate. Now let's talk about that real quick. Right there on the river, with all these new settlers coming in from the Carolinas, all these people coming into Southern Illinois, it became quite a criminal enterprise to rob them. So some of the guys that came up there had different occupations. And they began to use this cave that is right on the Ohio River as a place to attack people. How many of you have ever heard of Cave Rock? How many of you have ever seen Walt Disney and the River Pirates, Davy Crockett and the River Pirates? If you've seen that, you've seen Cave Rock. How many of you have ever seen How the West Was Won? If you've seen that, you've seen Cave Rock. Except they got one thing wrong in that movie. They had the people coming down from New York. Nobody ever left New York and then came down the Ohio to Cave Rock. It was they came from the Tennessee area to Cave Rock, or they came up to Kentucky from Kentucky. But anyway, this is an interesting cave. It's a state park in Illinois. But the two most famous people that were there are these guys. They were part of a Tory rape gang during the Revolution. And there's a book, an interesting book that I read, Heavenly Harvest, an article, Heavenly Harvest of Vulnerable Women in North Carolina, Tory Troops as Sexual Predators. These guys went around and just wreaked havoc on everybody. And they are the Harpy Brothers. You may have ever heard of the Harpy Brothers. They were such a big deal that even Daniel Webster would talk about them as, you know, what's going to happen when they have to make a deal with the devil, because there's no way they're going to get anywhere but hell. And these guys were sexual predators who actually, after the war, they fought it. They were at Kings Mountain. They were lots of different places. Was loyalists, but they eventually joined up with the Cherokee, and they lived with the Cherokee for a while in raiding parties. And when Nick and Jack was finally attacked by Shelby's men, they fled there. They ended up in Knoxville. And they started moving along, and they're basically what some people call the first serial killers in the United States. Probably not, but they list them as that. They were